Hi everybody, I'm Ezra cannabis consultant, author of Cannabis Consulting, which is out. You can order it on Amazon, and you can find me at ezrahelps.com. Today I just want to talk about why cannabis is a social justice issue even after legalization. So what this means is, so if you don't know how cannabis in general is a social justice issue, basically, we have laws that are that say cannabis is federally illegal, and although people of color and white people use cannabis at basically the same rates, the arrests and prosecutions and jail time for people of color is a lot higher than for people who are in higher economic standings or people, Caucasians. So it's a social justice issue because of the legal system, but it's also a social justice issue because of health. I deal primarily with people who are sick, and so having access to cannabis, if it helps them, is, I believe, a right. And when we legalize cannabis, it does, in general, mean that people have access to it. But there's a lot of people who fall through the cracks, and I just want to talk about that somewhat and explain to people where the black market is versus where the above ground market is. Now, the black market essentially is people who have grown cannabis in their homes or grown it out in the woods, or they get it from other countries or other growers, and they're selling it underground. They're selling it in people's homes, they're selling it to each other. And the reason why we don't want the black market is because we don't know where this cannabis is coming from. We don't want anyone to be hurt or harmed in the process of utilizing this cannabis. But all the ways that keep this cannabis safe are accessible to pretty much anybody. You can test cannabis. You could buy cannabis on the street and then send a little bit of it to a testing lab and see if it is safe to consume. So this is, even though that is black market cannabis, it's quite easy to determine whether cannabis that you're consuming is safe. So the black market has been in existence for many generations, despite it being illegal. And a lot of people, and I'm in a culture and in a community where there's a lot of home growers who've been growing for decades. And fortunately, in the state of Massachusetts, we've legalized home growing. But it's still illegal for those people to sell their own cannabis. It's illegal for people to sell plants, for example. And the legal market is a good solution to determining, how the state is going to get tax money from this, where the cannabis is being produced, etc. But the people who are investing in the legal market are following all the regulations, and therefore they're selling cannabis and aren't being charged with any crimes if they're following the regulations. The irony is you could sell thousands and thousands of pounds of cannabis out of your legal shop, but you don't really know where that cannabis is going. People are purchasing it from you, and where that cannabis ends up is anyone's guess. You could purchase cannabis legally from a dispensary and then go sell that illegally somewhere else. So although we have a legal market, it doesn't really completely address the black market issue. It doesn't address where things are coming from, because once it leaves the building, it gets broken up and spread out and can go anywhere. And what I always worry about is that dispensaries, they're following all the rules, so they're not charged with a crime if they sell cannabis. But if an individual has cannabis and they sell it to somebody, that is a criminal act. Now, unfortunately, that individual might not have the legal resources to defend themselves, even though they're actually doing the same thing or even selling the same product that they're getting from the dispensary. So it's a little confusing there as far as a legal situation. it's also a social justice issue because the price of legal cannabis is in general higher than the price of black market cannabis. Black market cannabis is very pervasive. It has increased as we've legalized across the United States. The price of legal cannabis has gone up. Not the price, the amount of legal cannabis has gone up, and the amount of black market cannabis has gone up. So there's just more cannabis available. There is more around. A lot of individuals feel comfortable getting it on the black market and don't feel comfortable getting it from a dispensary because they're standing in the community. And I don't think that should be criminalized for them. I think that the act of purchasing it or someone selling it between individuals should be decriminalized. And that way people who are sick, who don't have access to a dispensary, who maybe can't access the price point of a dispensary, can still safely purchase cannabis and have access to cannabis without the risk of legal prosecution. We also have whole communities, whole cultures that have utilized cannabis and sold and bought and used cannabis in their economies for generations that aren't necessarily getting access to this legal market. Typically, I'm talking about communities of urban communities of color, communities of infirm people, sick people, and impoverished communities. These are communities where you can buy an ounce of marijuana for $300 and then sell it to your friends and make maybe a few bucks on the way. And that's a criminal act. But this is an economy that's been existing for generations, for decades. And I don't necessarily think that opening up big legal dispensaries is going to help those communities have access to that legal market when they've been surviving for decades without it. In fact, I know communities where you can go to a little corner store and you can get your bread and your milk and also get a little marijuana from behind the counter. That's an illegal transaction. And but those communities are surviving economically from that. That's where they're comfortable purchasing cannabis, and often the cannabis is the same or very similar to what they're getting in a dispensary. So it's not that I feel that the legal market is bad, or that illegal transaction in a little corner store in an urban area is better or good. I'm just pointing out that we're still dealing with that social justice issue, that the people running that store or the people purchasing from that store are considered criminals, even though that act of purchasing some cannabis is the exact same act as purchasing cannabis at a legal dispensary. The only difference there is that shop in the urban environment is not required to have or they should be required, but they don't have an analysis of that cannabis. They don't know if it's clean or not. But there's also evidence that dispensaries are finding workarounds in terms of getting their cannabis analyzed. It's actually impossible to know that the exact amount of cannabis that you have is the same as what has been tested in the dispensary, because if you're smoking cannabis plant, one part of that plant can test differently than another part of the plant. This is a very organic thing. It is a plant. It's processed like we would process other vegetables from the garden. It's difficult to tell when we have something that is a perfect clean product and when it's not clean. My assessment is that in general, especially if we eliminate the Mexican cartels and Mexican cannabis, if we can legalize cannabis and decriminalize the sale of cannabis in the U.S., then Mexican cartels will make less money. And that's where you're going to get the cannabis that has pesticides on it and things like that. For the most part, local growers, home growers are producing cannabis that's pretty clean. At least in my community in Western Massachusetts, this is a very stringent kind of moral code that the cannabis be organic and clean. So, and I've heard of dispensaries that have had a really hard time as they mass produce cannabis, producing very clean cannabis. So it's still a social justice issue if we say, okay, these people who've invested millions of dollars into dispensaries can have the legal right to sell cannabis, and these people who don't have the money don't have the right, and so one is a criminal and one is legal. That creates a huge gap between that, because one person can go to prison for what they do, the other people can just profit from that. So that has to be addressed still in society, even after legalization. The black market is going to exist. Once you have cannabis in your hand, unless you can afford to give it away to everyone, which is legal in the state of Massachusetts, then you're going to have people who are running the risk of being criminals by selling it to other people. It's a very high value product, and it's my personal belief that people should have the ability to sell their cannabis. If you produce a beautiful organic cannabis in your home, you can get it analyzed and have a analysis from a laboratory saying that your cannabis is clean. I believe that you should be able to sell that to people or sell it to a dispensary. So since this is not allowed and they don't have regulations for that, anyone who does that is a criminal. So that is still an issue we need to deal with. We also have medical access, so people who can't get to it, people who need more one-on-one care, people who need a more diverse access to products. You can go to a dispensary, they might have 10 strains. If you try all 10 strains and they don't help you, but your buddy has an 11th strain and you want to buy it from him, all of a sudden that's a criminal act. But as a sick person, I believe you should have access to what can help you. So if we had regulations that allowed the decriminalization of sales, then people who have a wider spectrum of products would be able to provide for patients and be caregivers for patients. We also have the law enforcement issue. So if law enforcement sees, okay, here's what the regulations are, you have to be a licensed dispensary to sell marijuana, in their eyes, everyone else is still a criminal. So even if you've completely legalized in the state, if you have a little bit of marijuana and you sell it to somebody, or even if you have some marijuana and they think you might sell it to someone, you can still be charged with crimes that have federal jail time. So the layers of justice, the layers of issues are not completely addressed by just legalizing cannabis across the board. We have to acknowledge that this is a plant, and you can accidentally create this plant. You can accidentally create an illegal act by dropping a seed in the dirt. It can grow into a plant. And plants are when we have a cannabis plant, it is in its most benign form. A raw cannabis plant is not a dangerous thing. And I think that people should have access to plants. In the state of Massachusetts, anyone over 21 can grow plants. So those people should not have to hide that. And perhaps hide their green thumb. I have so many clients who want plants. They want to legally grow their own cannabis, and they don't know where to get plants from. So even after legalization, there's no dispensary in the state that can sell plants. So if we had some sort of legislation that said, all right, here's a certified plant producer, or here are some home growers who have gotten their soil analyzed, they know it's clean, their plants are clean, and they're allowed to sell it to their neighbors. Or just saying, we're going to decriminalize the sale of plants so that patients can legally grow their own and not risk becoming criminals by buying plants from somebody. Somebody who creates cannabis plants is putting a lot of work into them. They're spending electricity, time, energy, and money, and we live in a free market system, and I believe that those people should be allowed to sell their plants. I'm not saying that they should be criminals or that they're drug dealers, but it's really acknowledging that the field of cannabis is more than just these hidden giant dispensaries who grow it in secret, behind razor wire fences. That anyone can grow this plant, and the laws need to fully address the access to this plant and how people will choose to access it. Not everyone gets all of their groceries from Walmart. Some people like to get their groceries from roadside stands that sell strawberries and vegetables. And not everyone is going to get their marijuana from dispensaries. Some people like to get it from their friends, from their family, from roadside stands, if you will. So it's important that the legalization of cannabis still addresses some of the social justice issues. It's really sad to think that people can go to jail for growing cannabis, for selling cannabis, even when we've legalized it in the state and have giant producers who are doing the same thing. It's not illegal for me to grow tomatoes and even poppy plants that might produce heroin. I have lots of different vegetables in my garden, and if I put those veggies on a stand in front of my house, somebody can pay me for those vegetables. So cannabis it's a much more powerful drug, but we just do have to acknowledge that it's also a plant. It grows wild, and we're inevitably going to have people who want to keep their relationship with the plant and their relationship with the black market intact, because they've been doing that for generations and generations. All right, some things to think about in terms of the social justice issue in cannabis after legalization. Buy my book. It's called Cannabis Consulting. You can find it on Amazon. And I hope to see you next week at my next live cast. You can find me on EzraHelps.com. Thanks for joining.